Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series, today featuring Martha Waters for her wonderfully fun and love-filled new book, To Marry and to Meddle, in conversation with Alison Cochrun, author of The Charm Offensive. My name is Alex Schaffner, and I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith. We're in Brookline, Massachusetts. Maybe you have come to our events before. Maybe you have come through our door. If so, welcome back. It's lovely to have you here again. If you've never heard of us before, or this is the first time you're visiting us, thank you so much for joining our community today. By being here, by buying books, by spending your time with us, you're making us your independent bookstore, and you're helping keep our doors open and people happy by making yourself a part of this. So thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Alison Cochrun for being the moderator for this event. Alison is, as I said, the author of The Charm Offensive, with a new book coming out in November, Kiss Her Once for Me. Alison specializes in fluffy queer rom-coms, and after falling in love with her first book, our staff cannot wait to read the next. So Alison, thank you so much for being part of this event. Now it is my great joy to welcome Martha Waters back to our virtual author event series. Martha is the author of the Regency Vow series, To Have and to Hoax, To Love and to Loathe, and now To Marry and to Meddle. Martha is a South Florida native who is these days not just a writer, but a children's librarian in coastal Maine. And aside from the sunshine, water, and British kids books, Martha is a fan of running and gin cocktails and sundresses and travel, basically having a nice time. Also, I noticed that Martha has recently retweeted internet celebrity Jorts the cat, and I'm only bringing that up because an admiration of cats is truly relevant to this book. Martha's historical romantic comedies are a soul-soothing blend of tenderness, wit, and perfect chemistry. Her books have received starred reviews and praise from all corners. Only a few days old, To Marry and to Meddle has received stars from USA Today and Booklist. In this, Martha's third swoony, funny, lovely romance, Lady Emily Turner and Lord Julian Belfry enter a marriage of convenience. Emily has been scouting out the marriage mart for 6 years without landing a husband, while Julian has shocked everyone by being master of a theater. Alone, they're in two pickles, but married, they can bring respectability to each other. However, their marriage introduces each of them to more than one new idea and more than one new and enticing possibility. I can't wait to hear the author herself speak more about this delightful Regency romp, so it's my pleasure to welcome Martha Waters and Alison Cochrun.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be chatting with you, Martha, because you are one of my favorite authors. And again, this gorgeous cover, To Marry and to Meddle, is one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. And it just came out Tuesday. How has the last week been for you?
It's been fun. It's been exhausting. I don't know what I'm saying. Anything I say, don't hold it against me. I don't know what I'm saying. But no, it's been really fun. It feels surreal that this book came out, because the whole time I was writing it, I was convinced that I was never actually going to finish writing it. So it is very satisfying to be talking about it and not actually writing it anymore.
Yeah, that sounds right. I want to hear more about that. But we were just chatting before the event, because this is your third book to come out during the pandemic, which I feel like is a pretty rare thing, since it's been like your first book.
I had perfect timing, really, to get
really
all
did.
three.
To Have and to Hoax came out in April of 2020. So like one of the kind of figuring out how to do this whole pandemic debut thing. And then to Love and to Loathe came out last year at this time. I mean, what has that been like to only publish books during the pandemic?
I mean, I guess I don't have like a basis for comparison. I'm like, I don't know what it's like to publish books in a non-pandemic world, which, I mean, maybe that's a good thing that I don't know what I'm missing out on, which is true for you as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like it also, I was saying this yesterday, like, I feel like it set my expectations really low, which like sounds bad, but it's kind of nice, because it's like each book launch has felt like better than the one before it. Because when To Have and to Hoax came out, I mean, like, I had like in-person events planned. Like, I was supposed to go like to a book festival. There was all this exciting stuff that was going to happen. And I mean, I like the amount of time I spent thinking about the fact that if my book had come out like 1 month earlier, I would have snuck in right before everything shut down, which there's no point in thinking about that, but I thought about it a lot. So that was kind of sad, especially because like, and everyone was still scrambling. Bookstores weren't even open. I didn't sign any copies of the book for like months afterwards. I sent in book plates and I like hadn't actually like signed a copy of the book at a bookstore for like, I don't even know how long after it came out. And like I did my launch just as an Instagram live because no one had like fully figured out like virtual bookstore events yet. Like, I mean, we were all just kind of like, what is happening? I don't know. Are we all about to die? Maybe. So then like last year, 11 to Loathe came out when everyone was starting to get vaccinated and like all the stuff was still virtual, but it felt like much more hopeful and optimistic. And like people actually had the attention span to care about books. I think that was the worst thing about those like really early pandemic debuts, like March, April, May, was it felt like everything was on fire and no one actually had the mental capacity to think about books, which I mean, I was barely reading at that time, so I can't judge people for this. So that like felt a lot better last year. And then like this year, I got to actually do an in-person event for the first time this week, which was weird. I was like, oh, they're like I know there are people watching me at the virtual events, but I could actually see them watching me at the in-person event. And I'm like a little like socially awkward weirdo now. So who knows how that went. But yeah, so basically I have no expectations. So each year I'm like, this is great.
I love that. It's a great way to approach pandemic publishing. And I'm so excited that you got to do an in-person event because that just seems like after 2 other books of not being able to do that. Like I'm so happy for you. Especially because as you just said, like this was the hardest of the series to write. And so I know you've talked about this a lot before, but I'm kind of just curious, like aside from the fact that it was the pandemic, right, which has just made everything so hard, like why do you think this book was more challenging for you?
Yeah, like I've heard of like, I know a lot of authors for like writing during the pandemic is a nightmare. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely, that was a factor. And like the fact that I don't write very well at home, like in the before times, I would always be writing in a coffee shop or something, like that didn't help either. But I also think that even in like non-pandemic times, this book would have been kind of a nightmare to write because the rookie mistake possibly that I made was that when I wrote my first book, I very clearly set up like 3 other couples and in the book. And so Julia and Emily have kind of been together on page for 2 books now. And like I had to write enough that it didn't feel like I was leaving them hanging at the end of each book. Just because like Emily's in this really awful situation where her parents are like forcing her to entertain this suitor that she really hates. And that's like established in the first book. And it's like, okay, well, these books are all supposed to stand alone, even though it's a series. And so I don't want to like leave her completely hanging here. And since I'd introduced Julian and they'd kind of had like a spark, like at my like editor's prompting, I kind of like fleshed it out a little bit in revisions of the first book, just to give it a little more like he's starting to pay her some attention. So it feels kind of like promising when it ends. Like you don't feel like abject pity for her. And then in the second book, they all go to this country house party and they're there together as well. And by the end of the book, she's like mentioned that he is like alluding to marriage, but like hasn't actually proposed yet. And so when it came time to write this one, I was like, I don't know where to start. I started writing it Memorial Day of 2020. And I wrote for like 3 weeks and I was just like trucking along. And then I got to a point where I was like, oh, actually the book could start right here. Like everything I've written for the past 3 weeks, like not necessary. So I like tossed it out and started another draft and was like, okay, well that happens. And I started writing that new draft and I was like, I feel like this is too late for it to start. I think it's confusing just to drop you down into the action. So I tossed out that draft and then I started another draft going back earlier, but not as early as the first draft. And this continued for literally 10 first drafts that got like more and more unhinged and they're like titling in my Google Docs. Like it was like first draft, take 2, first draft, 3, first draft. And then gets down to the end. It's like wishful thinking. It's like, this is the first draft that's finally going to work. That was not the first draft that finally first draft number 6 or 7. And then I got to like 10th times the charm. And by the time you have a doc entitled 10th times the charm, you're just like, wow, things have gotten very bleak here. And then after all that, I was like, I had to Zoom with my agent about it because she was like, we've got it. Like, we need to figure this out. Like, what's happening here? I was like, I don't know what's happening. Like, and then when I submitted a few chapters to my editor and she was like, okay, I would like to Zoom with you. So my editor and I Zoomed for like an hour and a half. And we basically like completely tossed out the outline I'd sent her and like reworked a whole like concept of the book because I clearly needed help. So we got there in the end. I'm very happy where we ended up. But yeah, for other romance writers out there writing a series and trying to set up future couples, I recommend not putting them on page together as much as I did.
That makes sense. I can totally understand that would be difficult. Also, I found that story to be very comforting. So thank you for sharing it. Because and obviously what we see on the page like came together so well. But I think sometimes, yeah, we don't always see the like complex process that happens and how collaborative it can be like in working with your agent and editor. So, I mean, it was worth it in the end, all of that struggle. And you've also said that like of the 3 so far in the series, in the Regency Vow series, female protagonists, like that Emily's the one you relate to the least or like feel the least connected to, which I thought was super interesting because I think of the 3, I think she's the one like I want to be like, I'm like Diana, you know, like I want to think that I'm cool and like witty. And I think Emily is very witty too, but I think she's the one that I connected with the most. So I'm just kind of curious to hear more about, how you brought Emily to life and like put her on the page and kind of what that was like.
Yeah, I think I'm the most like Diana in like bad ways, not in the like being cool and flirty way, more in the just like being secretly insecure about her art and also out of touch with her own emotions and like possibly unintentionally offensive to other people. Like all of her bad traits, I'm very like Diana. But Emily is like so nice and so polite and so agreeable. And I am generally not those things, unfortunately. But when I was writing her in the first book, I already had an idea of like what I wanted, like her kind of like character arc over like her future book and kind of over the course of the series to look like. And I also kind of like, I felt like, even though we weren't very similar, I felt like I like knew who she was from as soon as I started writing her. So in both To Heaven to Hoax and To Love and to Loathe, I tried to include like a few small moments where like she would say something that wasn't like quite what you would expect her to say or something, or just kind of like give a hint of hidden depths or like hidden sauciness. Like my friend's mom finished reading To Love and to Loathe, and she was talking about, this is like before To Love and to Loathe even came out, and she was saying how she was excited for Emily's book. She's like, I think she has hidden depths. And I was like, well, good. That was the impression I was hoping you would get from like reading the first 2 books, is that like she's not just this polite, proper, like bland character. Like there's a lot more to her. I do think the fact that I relate to her so much less than I do to Diana, and to like a lesser extent Violet even, made me like, I think it made me lose perspective on the book a little bit. Like I forget that, which is stupid, but like I forget that not everyone is me and not everyone relates to like a book or a character the way I do. And so I was worried that people wouldn't like this one as much. And I'm like, I'm sure there are people who don't like it as much, but there've been a lot of people who've like messaged me to be like, oh, I think I relate to her the most out of all your characters. And I'm like, really? Like, wow, shocking. Not all people are the same and have different experiences. Like, who would have thought? But that's been really like gratifying to hear, because I was like, well, I wanted to get it right, but I feel like I don't personally relate to her as much as to some of the others. So it's been sort of like rewarding to hear that feedback from people.
Yeah, I really connected with her and just really liked getting to see inside of like her head throughout this book. But I have to sort of like, are there parts of Emily that are you? Like, did you kind of have to infuse parts of yourself in her as a character, or is she just like, you have nothing in common? I
think the way that I'm like her is I'm not a very like quiet person. But I think like sometimes like in a crowd, either I'm like the center of attention in a crowd, I'm like talking a lot, or I'm like literally just standing there silently, like creepily with like listening. And so I kind of tapped into that side of me, the way like Emily sometimes in the background in scenes, like listening to her friends go like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So I can relate to that because occasionally that's me. And yeah, and I think it also just helps. Someone asked me recently which one of my heroes I would marry, and I was like, oh, Julian, like hands down Julian. So I think it was like helpful that I was like, from a writing perspective, I was like, well, I would easily fall in love with Julian if he was a real person. So it's very easy to write her like falling in love with him. Yeah, I mean, I love all of my heroes, but I feel like in some ways Jeremy and James are both like similar to me in certain ways, and Julian isn't that similar to me. And so I'm like, yeah,
more, yeah.
I'd marry him.
I was going to ask, like, do you also give parts of yourself like to your male heroes as well?
It's funny because I wasn't really like when I wrote my first book, I wasn't really conscious that I was doing this because I was just like, I'm like creating characters. And the first book was so much driven by the premise, because the premise of To Have and Toast is like her faking consumption and it being this like escalating game of like chicken almost with like that came to me before anything else. And so it was very much like I developed their characters like in a way that would make sense to like serve the plot and premise that I'd come up with, like while having like James have all these like trust and communication issues and everything would like fit in with like the premise of the book and stuff. So I didn't see it as much until I was done and I was like doing past pages and like I had arcs and I was starting to give them to like my family and friends. And my sister was like, I think you're kind of like James actually. And I was like, I could see that because like I'm a little emotionally stunted as well. Like I can be weird and secretive about my personal life with my friends and stuff. So that was interesting in that it was kind of like unintentional. And it wasn't until after I like had a finished book that I started to like see the ways I'd put myself into the characters. With To Love and To Loathe, it was much more like deliberate. Like I was sort of, as I was writing it, I was very conscious of the fact that I was sort of tapping into some of my own insecurities and my own like personality and some of my own like negative traits with both Diana and Jeremy, who are very similar to each other. I would argue like more similar than a romance hero and heroine generally are, but like I feel like a lot of times it's sort of like an opposite attract type thing in romance, which you see with Julian and Emily here.
Yeah.
Diana and Jeremy are more alike, but I feel like they work.
Yeah, it works really well. And I love that book and their dynamic as well. And so I feel like in that book, them being similar is what made sense. And plus also kind of made it a fun play on our expectations about gender roles, like in the Regency era, is the similarities between them. So this is kind of a departure question. And again, for those of you who are here, thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions, put them into Q&A, and I would love to ask Martha them when we get to the end of this event. So in the back of this book, you have like an author's note about your historical research. And I just am constantly in awe of historical romance writers because the amount of research that in my head, I imagine goes into it is so daunting. And I'm just like so impressed. But you talk a little bit about your research process there and kind of what you choose to go along with, like what you choose to stick to historical accuracy about and what you kind of choose to depart from. And I kind of just want to know more about your research process. And if you're willing to share, like, where did you kind of start with the whole series and then with this book in particular?
So I do feel like this varies a lot from writer to writer because some historical romance writers write like historical romance that much more directly engages with the history. Like I always use Evie Dunmore as my example of this because so like like I've seen her talk about like the research she does for hers, and like we did an event together last year and she talked about it a bit, and like it's like an incredible like academic level of research that she's doing for those books, and you can see it on the page because those books are so engaged with like the women's suffrage movement and all these sort of like forces, like socio-political forces at work in Victorian society, and that's very much like at the heart of the plot of her books, and you couldn't separate out like the romances from the like politics of the history that's happening. And I am like in awe of her books and her writing basically. Yeah. This is actually just an Evie Dunmore like fan event here.
That sounds amazing.
Whereas that's like, and I feel like it's kind of like a spectrum. Like there's people like further on that end. And like, I would argue I'm more on like the Julia Quinn end of the historical romance spectrum, which I think I've like seen interviews where she talks about this as well, where she's like, I don't actually do that much research because if you've written a certain number of regencies, like, you know, a lot about the time period. When I started writing my first book, I'd already read so many Regency romances, and I was like a modern European history major in college, like focused on Britain. So I knew a lot about the era already. And I didn't know really like since my plot didn't really have anything to do with actual like politics or like historical events at the time, I wasn't sure like what I needed to know. So for my first book, I wrote a whole first draft, and anytime I hit on like a detail that I needed, I would just like highlight it. And then after I finished it, I went back and read this whole book that I have somewhere on my bookshelf. It's like I've used it enough that I kept getting it from the library and like renewing it. And I was like, I'm gonna buy this. And it's called Georgette Heyer's Regency World. And so it literally is like a history book about the Regency, specifically like what characters and what would be relevant to like aristocratic characters in romance novels. So like what kind of carriage someone would drive, what kind of like the fabric of their dress would be if they were going out in the morning versus going out in the evening, any kind of like detail, like what the average salary of a member of your household staff would be, like things like that. So anytime I hit upon a detail that I needed to like flesh out, I could consult that. There were a couple of other like books just sort of about like, there's one called like what Charles Dickens, who Jane Austen knew and what Charles Dickens ate, something, or maybe the reverse. It's about just like 19th century life in Britain. So things like that. And then I just kind of filled in the details because my books, I feel like the tone of them is fairly modern. That's why I get a lot of crossover readers, I think, who are people who mainly read contemporaries, but also read mine. So I'm definitely not striving for a like, I'm not trying to convince you that I'm Jane Austen here. It definitely, there's supposed to be a sort of a contemporary spin on them, but I still want like the details to feel like more or less correct, but I'm also not really killing myself. If like something's inconvenient for the plot, then like I don't care. We're just gonna toss it up then, because your average reader, like they don't care. And the ones that do care probably wouldn't like my books anyway, because they'd probably feel just like the voice would feel too modern for them. So I'm just like, you can't win over everyone. This one was a little trickier because it takes place in the theater, which I really knew nothing about. So I read this whole book called The Time Traveler's Guide to like British theater. It was like 400 years of history of British theater, which is really, really interesting because there's all these weird things that happen. Like they had this whole law in effect for like 100 years or more, where you had to get like a royal patent to perform spoken drama, and only a few theaters had these. So all the other theaters, which Julian's would have been one of them, if they wanted to like perform a play, they would basically like set it to music. So it technically wasn't spoken drama. It was like a burletta instead. So there's all these sorts of things. And I had this brief, in like some early draft, I had this brief delusion that I was going to incorporate this whole like plot where Julian's trying to petition Parliament to get rid of the patent system and like blah blah blah, which is like something that happened like 30 years later in the 1840s. The law finally was struck down, but like I was like going to do this whole like alt history, like my hero is now a politician and he goes to Parliament, blah blah blah. And like I was either talking, I can't remember if it was with like a discussion with my agent or my editor, and they were like, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. And I was like, cool, I don't want to. This might be too much history. Like I do think it's interesting, but I do feel like it maybe would have overpowered the plot a little bit, and it would have been like a weird turn since my books don't tend to directly engage with the history that much. So yeah, I feel like it's like they're period pieces as opposed to like historicals. Like we're here for the vibes.
Love that description. Well, and I think part of it, and like I read that author's note because I was so interested in the theater aspects of the story. And so I was curious if like there was a reason why you chose to focus on theater, because it's introduced in the first book, right? And like always kind of part of Julian's character. So is that sort of, did you plan to have the theater be such a big part of the story, or?
It kind of happened. It's like, I've been thinking about this. It's really hard for me to remember because I started writing To Have to Hoax at the end of 2015. And so it's been like 6 years now. So I've been having a really hard time remembering what my exact thought process was. I know that there were like several things happening. Like first was the fact that Emily's whole storyline was inspired, as I mentioned in the author's note, like by this little minor anecdote in a like nonfiction book I happened to be reading at the time about this, a daughter of one of the Dukes of Rutland in like the early 20th century, whose mom made her entertain this really terrible suitor in order to try to keep her brother out of the trenches in World War I. It's like, it just like stuck in my, I was like, oh, that's like would be a really great like plot line for a romance novel, actually, like this poor like woman like escaping from this awful controlling mother and like finding love, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, I was kind of trying to figure out like what Emily's backstory was and everything. And so I gave that to her. And then at the same time, I was drafting To Have to Hoax, and then we needed someone to be a fake doctor. And I was like, well, I feel like it would be really scandalous for them to actually have like an actor or actress like come into their home, like while she's like Violet's like in her sick bed. And so I was like, well, what if I had it be like some aristocrat who's sort of kind of scandalous? And that was how the character of Julian was created. And then it tied in really nicely because the real life inspiration for Emily, she ended up like, once she like ditched her mom and told her to F off, she ended up like appearing on stage and blah blah blah. And I was like, well, I don't want Emily to actually appear on stage because that's just like, even for me, that's a bridge too far in terms of like historical inaccuracy. But I was like, well, what if I like this could all tie in nicely? And then as soon as I had Emily and Julian like interact, it became really clear that there was like a spark there, which I wasn't 100% positive. Like the first one I wrote Julian and Diana in a scene, I had like a 5 seconds where I thought they might end up together. And by the time I finished the scene, I was like, no, I don't think so. I think Diana just needs to be with Jeremy because they keep stealing every scene they're in. So yeah, there were just a lot of things happening at once and it all kind of naturally came together. Until then I started to write this book and I was like, oh, well, shoot, now I need to actually learn some stuff about the theater because I have to write an entire book about it.
Yeah. Okay. But I thought that aspect was like super well done. And I just liked the way it connected to both of the characters' journeys. And so, yeah, I love that aspect. And I thought it was like, because I'm not as much of a historical romance reader, and I've come to it much like more recently, like in the last 2 years, I never, like, to me, these seem so historical. I'm like, oh, she must do so much research. It feels like, even though I love, of course, the more like contemporary voice and the ways in which you kind of like play around with the tropes of Regency romance. But I feel like in general, and this is like kind of an oversimplification, but it seems like historical romance doesn't get as much attention as contemporary romance, like within the like gigantic world and popular, amazing world of romance. And I know a lot of people were really upset this year that there weren't any historical romances nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards for romance. But then at the same time, we have like Bridgerton, which is this huge pop culture like juggernaut right now. And I know you have a lot of like feelings about the series. And so I don't know. I think I'm always kind of surprised because I think too, a lot of non-romance readers think of historical romance when they think of the romance genre. And so all of that to say, my question is like, what draws you to historical romance over contemporary romance?
So I feel like a lot of people get drawn to historicals because like the Regency romance is such a like staple of like the genre. It's like other than like contemporary, it's like the biggest subgenre probably. But like for me, it was the opposite. It was like I got drawn to romance because I loved like the Regency and I loved like, I'm just like an Anglophile. I was talking about this at my like in-person launch, how I feel like it started out as a child reading a lot of British children's books and basically wanting to be a rabbit wearing an apron living in a tree stump in the English countryside. And then it ended with me writing romance novels. It's like the rabbit to Bridgerton pipeline. But yeah, and so I didn't read much romance for a long time, but I did obviously like devoured Jane Austen as a teenager, like any Anglophile does. And then when I was in college, I started reading Georgette Hare. And then when I was in grad school, I took a popular materials class where we had to read a romance one week. We read a different genre each week. And I picked a Julia Quinn book because I liked England and I liked British period pieces. And I wasn't like, I still wasn't sure if I was going to like it or not. Cause I was like, I don't know, romance, but kind of ignoring the fact that like, I loved YA fantasy and everything I loved about YA fantasy is all the romantic subplots in it. Like, I mean, like I'm an idiot. Like, but when I read it, I was like oh, this is really funny and charming and like bantery and delightful. And that sort of turned me on to like the broader genre. But for me, like my love of England and of like British history was like the gateway to romance for me. And so for a long time, I only read historicals. I didn't read any contemporaries. And I think the first contemporary I ever read was The Hating Game, which like, I know people have strong feelings about illustrated covers, but listen, I don't know if I would have started reading contemporary romance without the illustrated covers because I didn't think I liked them. And the illustrated covers drew me in. And now there are plenty of ones that I have read and love that don't have the illustrated covers, but I definitely like, I was a sucker for those illustrated covers and that definitely got me reading contemporary. So I'm a fan of them. But yeah, like, but for the longest time, I was just only, I mean, like, I think for 2 years, I just read, I was still reading some like kids books for my job because I'm a children's librarian. But other than that, I was just like mainlining every book that Julia Quinn, Eloisa James, Lisa Kleypas, Sarah MacLean, Tessa Dare, like any of them had ever written. It was intense. Like I just would come up from the library with like a stack of like 15 mass market paperbacks.
Well, because they have some big back catalogs too.
Yeah, well, that's the great thing about romance. I feel like everyone I know who starts reading romance, it's like they're like, yeah, I read a few, and then I read nothing else for like months on end because you discover these authors and they've written like, I mean, so many of them write a book a year at least, and it's like, well, if they've been doing this a while, that's a lot of books. So you have so much to read. You just kind of end up doing this like deep dive, and you kind of like come up for air like 6 months later, and it's like, what is happening? I don't know. I've only been reading romance novels for 6 months. So at that point, like when I wanted to try writing one, because I was trying unsuccessfully to query a YA book that my friend and I had written, and we weren't getting any bites. And I'd never tried writing for adults before, but I was like, I've spent like the past year and a half only reading romance novels, basically. So why not try writing one?
I love that. And I love that history is what brought you to romance. Someone had a question in the Q&A, and I just feel like it's appropriate now. And so the question is like, what do you think of comparisons to Bridgerton, like by reviewers? Do you think there's like a better comparison or a different one that you would prefer?
So I have complicated feelings. I actually don't mind it in terms of my books. I think it's really accurate. Like my first book had the blurb on the cover from Lauren Willig, like compares my book to the Bridgerton series before the show even existed. Because I actually do think they're very similar, like in tone, like especially to the books. And like, I mean, anyone who's read a Julia Quinn book and then has read one of my books, I think it's pretty obvious that she was like a major influence on me. Like, I think it's a similar vibe. So I am like very, like, I don't mind at all. Like, I think that's very, I'm honored, like how kind. I do think the comparison has become a little bit meaningless because now it's become the thing. Like if this book takes place before the year 1900 or occasionally slightly after the year 1900, we're gonna like say it, you can like compare it to Bridgerton, and it starts to like lose all of its meaning. And I also think there's a little bit of a danger of like a book that I really enjoyed that also came out this week is Reputation by Lex Croucher, which is really fun. It's not a romance. It is historical, like women's fiction. I don't know how else to describe it. It's not a romance. There's definitely a really satisfying romantic subplot in it, but like the best way to describe it is Regency Mean Girls. Just like that's a much better way to like set your expectations for what you're going to get from this book. And I think like a good way to not be disappointed. It's really funny and very clever and just like unlike anything else I've read. It's a hoot. But I keep seeing people compare it to Bridgerton, and I'm like, well, no, Bridgerton's a romance, and this one isn't. So it's like situations like this where I'm like, these comparison is not helpful and possibly like harmful and like creating inaccurate expectations. So I mean, I wish people would use it a little more judiciously, but this is just how I feel like when anything becomes popular. Like,
yeah, that's just how it is. Yeah.
So, and I don't mind it at all with my own books. I actually think it's like a decent comparison. So carry on comparing them to Bridgerton. I'm flattered.
Okay, weird question. Is it just me, or does cartoon Julian kind of look like Benedict from?
Okay, so when I did my cover review, like last summer, my friend Caitlin Hill, whose YA debut Love from Scratch also came out this week. She emailed me and was like, Martha, he looks like Benedict Bridgerton. It's funny because I've been looking at the cover and I was like, he looks very attractive. And there is like some, like, who does he look like? And as soon as she said it, I was like, oh my God, he does look like Benedict Bridgerton. And now I like can't unsee it. So whenever I look at the cover, I'm like, there's Benedict / Julian.
That's been me. Every time I see it, I'm like, that just looks to me like Benedict. Like and so then there was a little bit of that when I was reading too, is like picturing that actor.
Yeah, I think the fact that like they're in profile also makes it easier to like since you're not seeing him like full, like the full face, you're just seeing the profile. It makes it easier to like imagine that he looks like that actor as well. But yeah, no, you were not the first person to say
okay,
that.
I think that was the case, but I just had to check. Because yeah, so kind of going back to thinking about historical romance as this genre that's, you know, obviously getting, because of Bridgerton and because of its like massive like popularity, getting more attention. Like, what do you hope to see from the historical romance genre, like going forward? Do you have things that you like hope to see included within the genre?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I just want like more romance adaptations across the board because clearly there's an audience for it. Hello. I do think like I'm frustrated that they're doing a spin-off series from Bridgerton that's like about like Queen Charlotte and stuff, which I'm like, it could be interesting, but I feel like what people really want is just more romance adaptations. Like, I'm like, they're learning the wrong lesson from this, which like their lesson is like, Bridgerton is popular. And it's like, no, that's not the lesson to learn from this. The lesson is that like people like romance novels. I want romance adaptations. I do think like the fact that they like the Bridgerton books are exclusively white and that they did diverse casting is like, oh, look how much bigger your audience is if the characters are not all white like people. Like, that's great. So I really hope that the success of that encourages A, more romance adaptations, B, adaptations of books by non-white authors, and C, just like more diversity within the historical genre more generally. And we're like, I mean, there are like some authors writing in that space already, like Kat Sebastian and KJ Charles write really wonderful queer historicals. Like Vanessa Riley writes really wonderful like historicals about people of color, and Adriana Herrera, who writes contemporaries, has a historical coming out at the end of May that I have read called A Caribbean Heiress in Paris, and it's set in 1889 at like the World's Fair in Paris, and it's like a Dominican like a heroine who like operates like a rum company and a Scottish hero, and it is like super tropey and over the top. Like it reminds me, it's like feels a little old school in some way, but also like very fresh because it's just like a super diverse cast of characters. So I just hope we see more things like that, because that book is like wildly fun. So I don't know, like I feel like Bridgerton, the show, even compared to the books, is obviously like wildly anachronistic. Like they don't even pretend to want to be historically accurate, which I completely admire. But I do feel like it's like people don't really care about like the Regency specifically. Like no one can argue that like Bridgerton is really Regency. It's just this like Disney version of the Regency. So I would love to see like more non-Regency historicals as well, which like, I mean, I was just talking about this with Rachel Hawkins at our event on Thursday night as well. It's like, I feel like the appetite is there. Like I hear it from readers all the time, and I would like publishing to catch up with that a bit, because like there are a lot of time periods out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Regency, what's so funny is that it's such a small time period.
I feel like my theory about this that I have been honing over the years is that basically Regency romance as a genre, we're essentially writing fanfic. Like basically everyone is, it's fun to write because it was this really short 9-year period of time from 1811 to 1820. And everyone, like there were so many like cultural like figures in that time, like Lord Byron, like Beau Brummel, like all these people that people are familiar with even now, 200 years later. And there's now been so much media set within that time period that we all have this like kind of established set of rules, like based on what we think we know of the Regency, which isn't always accurate. Obviously, it's like people didn't think they think there are only white people in the Regency, which isn't true. But it is sort of like we're all playing by the same rules in the same sandbox, and so it's like makes it really fun to write and read, because you like everyone knows that like Wednesday night at Almex, like people go to that, but also like the lemonade is really watery and no one actually wants to go to this. And like, I don't know, I just feel like there are a lot of, it feels fanficky to me, like, cause it's not really like, we're not writing a true version of the Regency. It's like this weird romance version of the Regency, which I'm okay with. It's fun.
I like your description of it being like the Disneyland, or like a Disney version of what that time period was.
Yeah.
I feel like that feels really accurate. Okay, well, so my question, like going off of that, is so you have 2 more books coming, right? In the Regency Vows series. Actually, you want to just tell us about those really quickly?
So I'm working on the 4th one right now. It is called To Swoon and to Spar, and it is about Penvale, who is the brother of Diana, the heroine of To Love and to Loathe, and like the friend of the heroes from all 3 of the first 3 books. And basically something that's been kind of mentioned in all the books but hasn't really been a major plot point is that he's a viscount, but his estate is like unentailed from the title, so it was sold off when his parents died. He's been trying to like earn enough money to buy it back ever since. So at the beginning of To Swoon and to Spar, his uncle has this ward he's desperate to get rid of, so he comes to Penvale and he's like, yo, marry my ward, you can have your house back. And Penvale's like, sold. So he and this girl Jane, a new character, get married, and they like toddle off to Cornwall, which is where his ancestral home is. And they get there and he's like, oh, wow, intriguingly, my house appears to be haunted. And what will be immediately clear to the reader and slowly, much more slowly clear to Penvale, is that Jane is actually the one doing the haunting, because she doesn't want this random husband. She likes this house like on a little sea cliff in Cornwall. And she's like, well, if I can just scare him off if he thinks the house is haunted, then I can live by myself, which relatable, obviously.
Yes, I think I'm going to have a lot in common with this Jane. That feels very relatable.
I identify with her a lot. Like she and Diana don't get along at all in the book, which is really fun to write. But I'm like, they're like both sides of me. Like Diana is my like less awkward side, and Jane is my like much more awkward, shy side. I'm like, depending on which day it is, I'm one or the other. Yeah. And then the final book will be about West and Sophie, who have been staring longingly at each other since the first book. And I have no information about that one because I haven't started writing it yet. I've just been thinking about it for like 6 years. So no pressure.
Love it. Well, congratulations on getting to write 2 more books in this series. I'm so excited. And you were kind of teasing that there was going to be a big announcement. And so I was like, leading up to this event, like, oh my gosh, what is it going to be? Like, what is she writing next? And I wasn't sure because I thought this was going to be the last one in the series. So I was like, ready to say goodbye. And I was wondering if there was like any possibility that you'd be writing a contemporary romance. And so my question is like, and I hope this doesn't sound weird, but your Instagram to me strikes me as being the Instagram of the heroine of a contemporary romance. Like you live in this like really beautiful, like picturesque, like seaside, like town in Maine, which just feels like the setting of a contemporary romance. And like you're a children's librarian and like a romance author and you have a cute cat. Like, I don't know, it seems very much the setup of a contemporary romance. Would you ever write contemporary romance?
I've generally in the past been like, I have no interest whatsoever. I'm like concerned I wouldn't be able to do it convincingly because I've gotten so used to writing historicals, even though like my historicals, I feel like are fairly contemporary in tone. I still don't know if I can like pull off a contemporary voice. Having said that, I have one single idea for a contemporary romance. The only idea for a contemporary I've ever had. But I have had it for a couple of years and I was having a meeting with my agent a few weeks ago and I like floated it to her and she was like, well, this is like an incredible like premise for a book. So the problem and I was like, full disclosure, don't know if I can write it. She's like, I understand. And she's like, I've never known you to want to write a contemporary. And I was like, no, I don't want to. This is the only idea I've ever had. If I write this, I will never write another one ever again. I mean, my famous last words. This is being recorded. I shouldn't say things like this. So no promises because I genuinely do not know if I'm capable of like sounding like a modern American woman, even though that is in fact what I am. So theoretically it shouldn't be that difficult, but I'm like wildly daunted by the task. Like all of you contemporary authors, I don't know how you do it. Like just talking about the modern world in a romance novel. Like, I don't know, that seems very tricky to me. So we'll see. I do have an idea that I am very fond of. So we'll see if it ever happens.
Now I'm like super curious and want to know literally all about this idea. But speaking of, I'm so surprised Puffin has not made an appearance at all during this book talk. Because Puffin was all like on camera before we started. But I love following Puffin anecdotes on your Instagram. I'll like
she's a celebrity.
Yeah. So if you don't follow Martha, definitely do. But so I asked you this beforehand and discovered that Puffin is not the inspiration of Cecil. And so, or Cecil, dang it. And I asked you how to pronounce it beforehand and everything. Cecil. And so I know that is not the inspiration. And we have now seen on your Instagram, your mother's cat, who is the actual inspiration. Like, is that cat truly evil? I mean, you told us an anecdote beforehand. So tell us more about this cat side story.
My friend's friend found an abandoned like 6-week-old kitten in his yard, like in May of 2020. And he was going to take it to the shelter because his cats didn't like it. And I was like, oh, no. So I took it into my home for a few days and like was trying to like bottle feed this kitten. And then I like convinced my mom, who's a sucker apparently, that like and he's so cute and so fluffy. And so through all these drafts of To Marry and to Meddle that I was attempting, there was no kitten. And then but I was also spending a lot of time like writing on my mom's front porch during the pandemic, just to write anywhere that wasn't my own living room. So I would go over there and she would like go inside and bring the kitten out so he could like sit on my lap. And so I got into like my final first draft, i.e. first draft number 10 or 11 of To Marry and to Meddle. And I really wanted to like interrupt their wedding night scene because I didn't want them to actually sleep together on the wedding night. And I was like, oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to like spend this? And then I was like, a kitten. And of course, the entire time I was writing, I was like, I do actually know a kitten, a very mischievous kitten that is in my life currently. So he's just like 100% based on my mom's kitten, who is very sweet, very snuggly, lets you wrap him up like in a blanket and carry him around like a baby. Also like murders small animals and left like a dead bird on my mom's porch, and she couldn't get the blood out of her steps for several weeks afterwards. So he's a
Oh
little
my
vicious.
gosh.
I know, but he's so sweet to humans, just not to like other animals. But yeah, he was a really fun character, right? I was really worried that my editor was going to make me take him out because I was like, is this like too indulgent? Like, does he actually serve any purpose in the plot? And she was like, I would like more Cecil, please. Like I would like more of the kitten in the next draft. And I was like, yes. So yeah, he's a celebrity now. We're trying not to let it go to his head. And I'm trying not to let Puffin become aware of the fact that I wrote about a cat that isn't her, because that feels a little rude. But like, yeah, he's an iconic cat. My mom threatened to lace him with kitty CBD and bring him in a cat carrier to my in-person book launch. And I was like, you cannot do that. Please do not bring a drugged cat to my book launch. Like, I do not want this. Like, no.
I really would love to have seen what happened when that cat showed up.
But no, I was like, I feel that it's for the best that we don't do this.
And I think the photo of you on pub day, like holding the cat, was enough. Like, I feel like we got the vibes. We could see the inspo.
I mean,
like,
my best friend was like, you should have posted like you should have used that like multiple photo option that Instagram has and published like the entire series of them, because the one that I posted is by far the most attractive and least chaotic. Like it gets worse from there. And then I was bleeding afterwards, but you have to suffer for your Instagram posts, obviously.
So true. Yeah. Worth it for the gram. I love that. And I love that the cat has a real life inspiration. So we only have about 10 minutes left. So if there are any other questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A. But I would just love to know, as we're kind of getting close to wrapping things up, you've talked about a couple of books that you would recommend that are coming out soon. What else have you been reading lately? What else do you recommend?
So I recently read one, I think you have read this one as well. The most recent book that was like a true, like complete 5 stars, obsessed with it, one for me, with Something Fabulous by Alexis Hall, which came out back in January.
Yes, I loved Something Fabulous.
It is so fun. It is a queer historical romance that is like, so I cannot remember the last time a book made me laugh out loud this much. It is extremely silly. It's just like a complete romp. Like, it's very deliberate, like send up of the conventions of the genre, like very knowing and kind of winky at the reader, which I love because I kind of like winking at the reader as well in my books. But this is like on another level compared to what I do.
It's on a little Alexis Hall level. Like,
it's wild. It is. So completely unhinged. Like, I guess it's a road trip book, technically, is how like the best way to describe it, but it's just absolutely bonkers. It's like this duke who proposed to a young lady he's been like promised to for ages, who is a twin, and she is like, I'm absolutely not marrying this man. She's like pieces out and like runs away, and so he's stuck with her twin brother trying to like hunt her down. And of course, he and the twin brother fall in love, and it's so great. But no, it is absolutely bonkers. It's so funny.
That book was a complete surprise. Well, I mean, also, have you read Alexis Hall's other book? Have you read like Boyfriend Material?
Yeah, I love Boyfriend Material.
Yeah, I felt like it was very much like a historical version of Boyfriend Material, but again, like heightened in its like
the way he switches like tone and genre and stuff so much, because he's a bunch of other books that he like self-pubbed and stuff like before Boyfriend Material. I mean, they like vary wildly in terms of like fluffiness versus angst, like heat level. Like, I mean, it is like, he's so talented. And then I have not read yet. I have it on my iPad, A Lady for a Duke, which is the one that has the trans main character, female main character. And it's like a historical, and I cannot wait to read that one. It looks incredible.
It was so good. It was really just amazing. But I read Something Fabulous by him, which is, zany and wild and just like laugh out loud funny. And then I went into A Lady for a Duke, kind of expecting similar vibes. And Lady for a Duke is like angsty and like beautiful. And I cried like 4 times in the first half. So it's a totally different book. But
so
I think
talented, like the way he's so like switch, like it's wild to me.
Yeah. But I highly recommend, both of those. Anything else that you recommend that you're reading right now?
I've been really slow on reading lately. I have so many ones I'm really excited about. The one I am like saving as a treat until after I turn my book in is Cat Sebastian's next one, which is The Perfect Crimes of Mary and Hayes, which is like a Georgian era romance, and it's a sequel to The Queer Principles of Kit Webb, which was one of my favorite books of last year. So I am extremely excited to read that. I'm not allowing myself to touch it until after my book is due on April 29th, because it will be too distracting, because I am obsessed with Kat and like everything she's ever written. So
I also loved The Queer Principles of Kit Webb, and I'm excited for that one too. Nice. So we have a couple questions. So one of them is, can you explain your writing process while balancing a full-time job? And I think you now actually do you work part-time?
yeah, I'm part-time now, which has actually been like challenging in a different way. When I was full-time, it was definitely like I wrote in the mornings, but I know it doesn't work for everyone. It worked really well for me because I'm a morning person anyways. So I mean, I wouldn't have chosen to get up at 5 a.m. Like I'm not that much of a morning person, but like if I had to, and I also write really fast. And if I have a whole day to write, it's not like, I mean, if I'm like getting close to the end of the draft, I'm sure I can write like a bunch like over the course of a whole day, but generally I burn out. And if I have a whole day, I'll like, oh, hi, Puffin. I will like fill it with other things. I'll be sitting at my computer and like on Twitter, or like buying fancy tea to have shipped to me from England or something with my like Google Doc open in the background. So I'm writing. So it's kind of a waste of time. So just like setting a timer for like a half hour or 45 minutes in the morning, like I could knock out 1,000 words or something. And it was like, I was pretty speedy about it. So I was very big on writing first thing in the morning. Since I stopped working full time, I theoretically have more time to write, but it's gotten to be this weird thing where I have like I work Wednesday through Saturday now. And like, it's only a half day on Thursday. So it's like a 3.5 day work week, which of course is better than a full 40-hour week. But I feel this pressure like on Mondays and Tuesdays, like I should make the most of it by writing a bunch. And so I've been trying to write a bunch on those days. And I don't know, after I turn this book, I need to reevaluate how I've been doing this, because I'm not sure it's working, because I think I'm getting really burnt out, because I don't want to write it all on the days I have to go to work, which if I'm like deep in a draft, like it's best for me to write every day. Like I'm definitely not a like, you must write every day person, but if I like really am getting into it, I tend to lose momentum if I start taking days off. So I'm not sure that my current process is working ideally for me, which is funny because I thought my life was gonna be so easy once I stopped working full time. Now I'm like, no, I need to work even less. Like give me less hours. So grass is always greener.
Totally.
Yeah, definitely like with a full-time job, there's just, you have to be disciplined. Like I know some authors say like just like literally put it on your schedule, like at like a meeting or something, just like a non-negotiable thing. Because yeah, especially like before you're published, it's hard because it doesn't feel like it's really still a hobby technically, even if you're pursuing publication. And so your friends and family aren't going to be like, oh yeah, this is your work time. They're like, oh, this is like your hobby you're doing on the side. And even if they're very supportive, they don't really get it. So you have to have that mindset about it and be willing to like try to protect your own time, I think is key. And I obviously like, I don't have children or anything, so it's very much easier for me. I know it's like, I have multiple author friends who like work at least part-time, some of them full-time, and also have kids and also do books. And I'm like, well, you are a superhero and I don't know how you do it. So I have no words of advice if that is your situation, other than to say like, good luck.
Yeah. I have no idea how people do it with kids. Yeah, it's incredible to me because it's hard enough. Yeah, without that element. And so this is kind of goes along with that, but the other question we got is was your journey to finding a publisher and getting published? And then how easy was it for you since you're a librarian?
So I'm sure now she shows up. It took me a while to get published because I spent my early 20s thinking I wanted to write for kids and teens, which is still kind of like a thing I have in the back of my mind as like a maybe someday. I don't have immediate plans for that. But yeah, so I wrote a book right after I graduated college that I queried and got a couple of full requests, but didn't get an agent. And I feel like I gave up too soon on both of them because I am easily distracted by the next thing I'm writing, but whatever, it all worked out at the end. So I did that for like up until my mid 20s. And at that point I started reading romance, and that's when I switched gears, wrote a romance. To Have and to Hoax was the first romance I'd ever attempted to write. It was the first book for adults I'd ever attempted to write. It took me like 2 years to write or more because I had no idea what I was doing and I kept having to rewrite it. But once I finished, I had written down the names of a couple of agents that I knew I wanted to query. And then I also just, kind of like looked online at various websites that had agents. But the advice that everyone gives, I think is the best advice, is to like look at who the agents are, like in the acknowledgments and some of your favorite books, because that's what worked for me. Because when I read The Hating Game in summer 2016, I wrote down the name of the agent, which was Taylor Haggerty, because I was like, well, even though this is a contemporary, I feel like I love this book and I want to query this agent when I have a manuscript. And that was like a year and a half before I actually had a complete manuscript. And so her agency, Root Literary, I queried that they were one of the first 5 agencies that I queried. And so I only queried 5 agencies for To Have and to Hoax before signing with an agent. So that was weird and worked out really well.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was, I had no idea what I was doing also, because I like wasn't on like writing Twitter or anything at all, which I actually think for me was I know that like it's like a great resource for a lot of people. For me, it was a good thing, because I think I didn't like, I knew the odds were stacked against me because getting traditionally published is just hard. But I think I would have gotten so intimidated by the number of people out there also querying that I would have like given up. So for me, it was very good that I was not over there. I was just kind of like, well, this seems hard, but I'll keep trying. And then once I had an agent, like, you know, she gave me like a list of editors, like we did like one small round of revision. She had a list of editors. We sent it out on submission. We made it to acquisitions at a couple different imprints where it got shot down because they didn't believe that like a historical rom-com would sell, because Taylor had a very clear vision of like it being like published in trade, like having more crossover appeal, and like this was not successful in acquisitions meetings. But then we sent it to Caitlin at Atria and she loved it. And like we had a phone call on a Wednesday and the offer came in on a Friday. So it's kind of like that was like a whirlwind week. It had been on sub for long enough that I was starting to be like, maybe this book won't sell, which was not ideal because I had almost finished a first draft of Love and Love at that point. And I was like, wow, this would really suck if To Have and to Hoax doesn't sell. And I've already written a draft for the next one. But yeah, it all worked out because I have a great agent who knew which editors to send it to. So yeah, she's incredible. And then I landed with like the best possible editor who just like everything that she loved about. I remember telling Taylor after my call with Caitlin that I thought Caitlin loved everything about the book that like I loved about the book. And it was just like such a nice feeling. So yeah, it was great.
Love that. Any other questions before we wrap up? Go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I have one final like question for you, but it's because I know that you love to travel and I also love to travel, and because your books are like exclusively set in England. Do you have any plans to travel again soon? Are you still waiting? What's your travel like?
Yeah, I'm going to England next month. I have,
Yeah.
I think it might end up overlapping with when I'm on like a revision deadline, but I mean, I don't know for sure, but it might. But I was like, I can revise a book just as easily from London as I can from Maine. So why not just go? I studied abroad in London and I've been back several times since college, but usually just for like a few days since I was like, I lived there. I don't need to go on a whole trip to London. And like, so I usually combine it with like a trip to Paris or a trip to Wales or whatever. Like, I don't like do a whole London trip, but this time I'm planning on just spending like 10 days in London with like a few day trips. Cause I just miss it. And the pandemic has made me really appreciate like the places that I've been that I really love. And like talking about these books for the past 2 years, that being able to like go to England has made me like miss it a lot. So it's going to be my first transatlantic trip since the pandemic started is going back to England next month. Hopefully their current COVID surge has cooled off a little bit by then. I'm optimistic that it will have, since they've spiked so much recently that hopefully it'll be okay by the end of May. But I mean, if not, I'll just wear a good mask, I guess.
I'm so excited for you and jealous, but very happy for you that you get to go. And
I'm gonna take the books and like stage an elaborate photo shoot with like all the books.
As you should.
Yeah, my best friend may or may not be coming with me. She's not sure yet. She's trying to make it work with like plane tickets and stuff. But if she does come, I'm like, that'd be really convenient because I need people to take pictures of me with my books, like in front of like Mark. So you need to come.
Because otherwise you're gonna be asking strangers to do that.
Otherwise I will be asking random strangers to take pictures of me, which is fine too.
Yeah. I love that. Oh, that'll be incredible. And I can't wait to see the photos. That sounds amazing.
I'm excited.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Alex, for giving me this opportunity to talk to Martha. Thank you, Martha, for writing just such a lovely book that made me feel so cheerful when things have been pretty rough this winter. So I am just so grateful.
So lovely to get to talk to you. So we got to do an event together.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This was a really delightful conversation to get to sit in and listen to. Thank you to everybody who's in the audience for spending your Saturday with us. And We hope to have everybody back soon.